Welcome to another edition of City and State TV. My name is Gerson Borrero, and today we have a distinct pleasure of talking to, one of the new kids on the block, even though he's been around. He's now in the Assembly. Luis Sepúlveda, thank you for joining us here at City and State. We wanted to talk to you about politics. We're taping this the day before the election, a few days prior to Somos. So why don't we start first with the election?
Sure.
We're selecting a governor.
Mm-hmm.
We're going through the process of a state attorney general, a controller. How does Luis Sepúlveda, as an elected official and as a Puerto Rican Latino that has been involved for a long time, how do you see the body politics right now in New York State?
Well, I have some levels of disappointment and some expectations. We as Latino legislators in the state of New York, I think we have to demonstrate more unity as a group so that we can extract more for the community that we represent. I mean, we have a very diverse community, but the reality is that as a Latino legislator, representing a district that's about 60%, between 50 and 60% Latino, that's a group that we have to focus on with Somos. I think to some degree, we haven't been able to demonstrate the kind of power that we can have as a group. I've asked to work closely with the Black Puerto Rican Caucus and Asian Caucus, because I believe that if we form a unified group with the caucus, we're talking over 52 assembly people. We will have the largest and most powerful bloc in the entire assembly. And so let's use this next year with our agenda, with the budget, to make sure that we're able to extract what we think our communities are not getting. I'm endorsing the governor. I'm not 100% happy with the governor. I was not happy with his position on the DREAM Act. He felt that I don't think that he did enough, and I expressed that to him. He obviously disagreed with me. That's going to be a big part of our push next legislative session. He has made promises to us, and I also believe that mayoral control is going to define the next session in the Assembly and the State Senate.
Let me just take you back briefly to the DREAM Act. And I understand, and I'd like to know more besides the DREAM Act, because it seems like everybody points to the DREAM Act. But the reality is, Assemblyman, that the DREAM Act really is going to benefit only a small portion of Latinos, 11, 12,000 students. That's it. Why the persistence of the part of Latinos? It makes it seem like even on a national level, the Pew Research Center has indicated immigration is not among the top 3 issues that we have in the United States as a community, as Latinos. Right. And yet we keep talking about immigration and giving the perception that it is. The DREAM Act is not in the priority of the people that you represent in your own district are not. They don't have that as the number one. And it seems like our Latino elected officials, you included, you're very passionate about it. Why? Why is the DREAM Act so important to you?
Well, to me, the way I was able to make an impact in society was through education. And so we have students that are coming through our educational system from kindergarten to high school. A lot of these kids are excelling. They're top students in the state and in the country. At that point, then we say, you know what, you're on your own now. We can no longer pay or help you pay for your education, because now you're no longer a high school student. You're no longer a member of a student in the public educational system. Now you have to go fend for yourself. And to some degree, that's unfair. And yes, it impacts about 11,000 kids, but to be able to help, no matter the number of kids get an education, is important to us. And if you look at the budget itself, it's really not that much money in the overall budget. You're talking about approximately $25 million. And these students will become productive members of society, tax-paying members, and you offer a path to citizenship. And so I'm very passionate about the DREAM Act because I'm very passionate about education. And so I will do everything I can to make sure that DREAM Act becomes a reality. And remember, Gerson, this is now the number of students now. When you multiply year after year after year, I told Francisco Moya yesterday, we were at Baruch speaking at a forum.
That being the Assemblyman from Queens, who was also one of the leaders.
He's the main sponsor of the Assembly. He introduced it in 2010, 2 years before I got elected. And I made a statement yesterday at Baruch. I said, many of the students that were there were immigrant students. I don't know how many were undocumented, but I said, Assemblyman Moya, his bill will be something that would resonate for generations to come if it becomes a reality, because students for many years to come in the future, there are immigrant students from all over the world, not just Latinos, because remember we have Haitians, Jamaicans, Albanians, Russians, absolutely, West Africans. All of them will benefit from this act for generations to come. And I think once it becomes a reality, it's going to be a landmark piece of legislation.
What is it that the governor doesn't get, or is he right in saying you guys haven't done enough, which is some of the noise that I hear coming out as to his argument? Why should he do more? I mean, you guys got to really come up and really put the pressure on your colleagues in the Senate and be able to do that. Is the governor right in being like that far removed? It isn't that he doesn't care. I don't think you believe that he doesn't care.
No.
He hasn't done enough.
I generally believe that politics being equal and simple,
Right.
the governor would have signed off on it tomorrow.
Okay.
But, you have certain other realities. You have the Republican division, the Republican-Democrat division in the state Senate, so you have to deal with being able to get a bill through. Remember, we lost by 2 votes, and one was a Democrat who voted
Right.
against it. The reality is that if the governor's going to say we haven't done this enough as a group, I don't necessarily disagree with him on that position. I'd like to see the members of the Latino caucus unify as a force, so that the governor can sense and get the pressure that we as a legislative body can get. The governor's passionate about passing a budget on time. And it's during those periods where we can really exert some sort of influence.
If that's the case, then let me ask you, why have the conference? You have the fall conference, but you also have the spring conference. The budget is done with.
Right.
And then when you hold it in Albany, I know that you weren't one of the people, the founders there. There were people that preceded you, you're seniors.
Yes.
You're sort of like in the middle, and there's a lot of young Turks coming up. Not that you're old, but you're in that position
I like
where
to think of myself as a transitional guy.
as a transitional guy, because the young ones are too young still to
Yes.
be able, they're outfoxed by the older guys, and there's a lot of old guys still around that are
Sure.
very senior, and with all due respect, I don't mean it disrespectful, but having said that, does it make any sense for Somos to even be held in the spring? The budget is over. It's being held now. The budget is over. So what influence does Somos really have?
I'm still trying to figure that out. You're absolutely right. The Somos conference should be changed. The Somos conference should be something that, when it's held, will have a greater impact on the decisions on the budgets and legislation. So, just like you, I heard some. I'm still trying to navigate those waters. Remember, even though I've been in the political arena, so to speak, for over 22 years, I got elected in 2012. I'm fortunate enough not to have a challenger this year, so I'll be there for another 2 years. But there's been a certain level of disappointment in what I'm seeing from our members, and several things where I've seen that are good. When you have an issue that's going to impact Latinos in a way that impacts every single district, that's when you get some level of unity. Look, not to belabor the point on the DREAM Act, the governor made a challenge to us, have a point person. We have a point person. We have Francisco Moya, who I think is doing a good job, and we have Peralta in the state Senate. They're gonna be leading more of it.
That state senator Jose Peralta, also out of Queens,
right? Who's I believe the sponsor in the Senate.
Right, in the Senate.
So you want us to have a point person. You want us to put certain pressures on certain legislators. We have to do that. In fact, we should have done that even without the governor asking for it. But I believe, like the governor did with marriage equality,
Right.
what he certainly did with the SAFE Act,
Right.
he was heavily involved behind the scenes, making sure that that became a law, that they became laws. And I haven't seen that since I've been there, that level of involvement from the governor's office with the DREAM Act.
Among elected officials, mostly of the Democratic Party, that he can actually meet behind closed doors, do you think that the community is not doing enough? Maybe the governor hasn't felt the pressure of pickets in front of his office on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, or maybe up in Albany? Is it that even the communities affected by the DREAM Act and its passage are actually also too dormant and have become too, I would say, peaceful, docile?
Well, it's a hard thing to answer, Gerson, because you have different issues that impact the Latino community.
Right.
We're not a monolithic community, contrary to popular opinion. And so when you talk about the DREAM Act, you're talking about undocumented students who, it's not a large number. Mm-hmm. They have come up to Albany, they've rallied, they've had press conferences, they've spoken. The amount of pressure that they can put is minimal. So that is left to us as the elected body. Gotcha. But, again, you have Jamaicans, right? You have Haitians. Mm-hmm. You have Albanians. Mm-hmm. For some reason up in Albany with my colleagues...
Asians,
that's correct. For some reason up in Albany with my colleagues, it tends to be just a Latino issue. And when I spoke on the floor of the assembly for the bill, I said, the Asian community is impacted by this.
Correct.
You have, for example, in Brooklyn, you have Rick Perry, who's of Jamaican descent, right? You have in Nassau County, you have Haitian Assemblywoman,
Right.
Mickey Solages.
Right.
So, I'd like to see more involvement from those groups. Because, if we can unify,
Right.
if the Black, Puerto Rican, and Asian Caucus can unify,
Okay.
and make this one of the point agendas, then I see that the governor would have to then get more involved and make sure that the DREAM Act becomes a reality.
Let's keep swimming here because you've been around for 22 years in politics, but you didn't. So obviously, you didn't play the game over. You would have been held elective office way before if you had played the game in the Bronx, which is really
It's a tough ground.
It's a tough ground. I mean, Harvard government is, you can't get a degree from the Bronx unless you get your head knocked off and the backstabbing, and they kick your rear end from here to from the Grand Concourse all the way up to Kingsbridge and back. But so you're now in office.
Mm-hmm.
You come in from with a different perspective because obviously, even though I know you were with county at certain points with county leaders, you didn't go along to get along. So now I go back to this whole question as an elected official. We asked for a piece from you in terms of our special coverage on the road to Somos. And you came up with you carved out an area which I thought it was just your interest as a legislator, but that deals with mental health. You also revealed to us, to our readers, how it affected you personally. Mm-hmm. And you shared, and those of you that haven't read what Assemblyman Luis Sepúlveda actually wrote for City and State on the Road to Somos, you should read the piece because it's very moving, and it just goes from actually being concerned about the issues of mental health, which is a national issue, to actually, in a very personal way, talking about how at the age of 12, you didn't mention your age, but we got to talk. Mm-hmm. So at the age of 12, you're hit with the fact that you probably didn't know what your mother was suffering from, but please tell us the story of what happened.
Well, I mean, mental illness has impacted my family, not only with my mother. My paternal grandmother also suffered from mental illness. She was paranoid schizophrenic. My mother suffered from depression. And in fact, I was just speaking with someone who's a greater authority on this issue than I am, who tells me the trends that usually happen. Generally speaking, people who are successful at committing suicide have made at least 2 attempts before they finally are able to take their lives. And that was a pattern with my mother. I was a child, so I wasn't aware of the first attempt. The second attempt I was aware of. And obviously the third attempt, which she ultimately succeeded. But she struggled with depression all her life. At the time that my mother took her life, she was living in Hialeah. I was living in New York. I had just started living with my father. I lived with my mother most of my life. And she had gone to Hialeah. My parents were divorced. My 2 sisters were living with my mother in Hialeah. I was living with my father. And my mother was taking a nurse's exam, a practical nursing exam. She was preparing for it. She was working at a nursing home. She had scored almost a perfect score. I mean, we thought things were turning around.
She's okay.
Sure. And then, one day while I'm in school, a family member of mine came to pick me up. And unfortunately, the principal blurted out, so who was it that killed themselves?
Oh, God.
So, I mean, that's how I found out about it. And, it's a shock that you really never get over it. And until recently, I never really spoke too much about it. I don't know why, but I think the time has come now.
What made you go public and stuff? Because as I was reading, I got the piece that it was sent back to you. We wanted more from you, but when you revealed that, I remember, I called you and we talked, yeah. And it was because it's very difficult, especially then you revealed your age and you shared this very public. And now, of course, you're going public. What compelled you? Is it something that's been inside you? Do you think that now you can draw attention to the legislators, your co-legislators, to bring something? And what changes do you want to make? How do you want this to be of greater good than you're dealing with it publicly?
Sure. Well, it was I've not spoken about it in many, many years. It's not something that you reveal lightly. And then when we were working on the piece, I really contemplated whether I should include it or not. But I thought by including it, it sort of like adds more seriousness, and hopefully what has happened now, where it's drawn attention to Latina and Latino suicides throughout the country in New York State and New York City. Look, I serve in Albany with another assemblyman, Harvey Weinstein, whose son was disabled. He was handicapped. And Harvey used to fight every year in the budget. And the first session, that left an impression on me, that he was so passionate about it, that's when I started thinking about, well, his son is disabled. My mother suffered from mental illness. I wasn't seeing a lot of bills for mental illness. I introduced one with Senator Diaz in 2010 to compel the state to come up with more numbers and figures and treatment plans for people in the Latin community who are suffering from that. But I think what led me to open up about it was a conversation I had with Dr. Rosa Gill of Communal Life.
Of course.
A wonderful person.
Who has served in administrations and municipal government.
Oh, absolutely,
right.
And has educated me in a way that I could never be educated. We had a conversation when they were erecting a new building in my district for people that are suffering from mental illness. And one of the things that she told me was that she finds it sometimes so upsetting when people are adverse to having these kinds of housings in their neighborhoods. She says, people with mental illness are not necessarily a threat to the rest of society, and people with mental illness need housing too. And we started talking about mental illness, and that's when I spoke to her about it and said that my mother had committed suicide. And we had a conversation about other things that we can do. And it's been some time since that's in the back of my mind. Mm-hmm. And then you offers the opportunity to do something, and I spoke to my staff. I said, there's something that in 2 years that I've been in the assembly, and reality is for many years I've not heard much about, which is the suicide rate amongst Latinos in this country, and it's a terrible number, and it's something that we have to deal with immediately.
It's interesting because you mentioned Dr. Gill, and speaking to Rosa Gill is self-rewarding, and she is a good, wise Latina, very well prepared, as a Cuban sister that she is, and she's really well versed in this, very sensitive, and has all the background in terms of relating to a Puerto Rican who goes through this. But we also know that in our communities, we deal with mental illness in a different way, and it manifests itself, like for example, vete a ver el espiritista, deal with it on a spiritual level. Yes. Go deal with it de santero, santera. Yeah, for those of you who aren't understand that, is that we deal with this through religious forms that are legitimate, but rather, oh no, eso es que tiene un espíritu malo. You have a bad spirit that has possessed you. And this is true. Sure, yeah. And we go to the botanica and get an herb, and we do a baño, and this is with herbs.
Very well versed in that.
Yeah, of course. I grew up in this. This is how we deal with mental illness. Yes, so, ese muchacho tiene un espíritu malo. This kid has a bad spirit that possessed him when he was born. And you get into all of this stuff that it's not ignorant, it's just part of the culture. Mm-hmm. How do we take the stigma of the seriousness of mental illness, because people would rather go to a spiritualist, to a voodoo priest, or to a santera, with all due respect to those that believe in that. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that? Because it's easier, and it's behind the scenes, it's closed door, to tell them, come out, it's okay to deal with this, because there's another level.
Sure. I mean, a lot of it is the professional help that's available. Look at the group that has the highest rate, what's called ideation, that think about suicide. And the group that has the highest rate of actual suicide attempt, and it's young, first-generation Latinas that are here. Part of the problem is the cultural issue, right? Mm-hmm. In our culture, mental illness is almost taboo, right? We don't talk about it openly. We try to hide it in the closet, and that is part and parcel part of the problem in the Latino community. When they talk about a culturalization, right? For example, this program that Dr. Gill runs called Communal Life, fabulous program. One of the things that they deal with is young women, Latino women that come, for example, from the Dominican Republic or Latin American countries. They're much more rigid in those countries. When you grow up with mom, my daughters don't do this, they don't do that. La mujer está en la casa, las niñas están en la casa. You can't aspire as much. You have that with what we have here in American culture, where kids are get a lot more freedom than they normally get in these countries that they come from. And so you have that constant struggle, right?
For a young person coming here and dealing with the abuela and the tios and the titi, okay.
Right. These kids also tend to aren't doing as well academically, right? So they come here, they attend school, they're not doing well, they feel isolated in many instances, then to come home and deal with the cultural differences. So this communal life program helps. It's not a therapeutic program, it's an additional program. It enhances therapeutic assistance, but what it does is it brings the mother, the daughter together, helps them work out their differences, try to explain to the mother the difference in cultures and society here as opposed to their countries. It helps women, these young women, with academics.
So it's a holistic approach.
It's a holistic approach. In fact, it has creative art is part of the therapeutic process. And you see that program is working. I got some statistical numbers that indicate suicide rates throughout the city. Communal Life runs a program in the Bronx 6 days a week. And in fact, the only county where ideation and attempts decreased amongst Latinas was Bronx County.
How are you going to take that from this child of 12 who's lived with this pain, and at points you've hit it, it's very difficult. I understand it. How do you transfer that? How do you translate that to something that will benefit a greater number of people? You mentioned the communal, but I'm sure you have something like, do you have a bill that you're redacting now that you're going to be able to come up with, that you're writing? What is it that you, as an assembly member, what is it that you're going to do?
Well, I'm going to use, for example, this here, right? This interview with City and State has really increased the awareness already about the issue, especially amongst Latino legislators, because I've gotten calls to talk to me about my experience. I've asked these professionals that are involved in mental health throughout the state and the country. I'm speaking to a woman from the Harvard professor who runs a multicultural therapeutic program for input and ideas on how to best provide these services. I'm speaking with Dr. Gill and other healthcare providers to see if they can help me create legislation, and more importantly, the budget. How can we get more monies that are targeted for this specific group of young Latinas that are committing suicide at a much higher rate? The part of the problem that we have now is that since 2011, the funding mechanism for outpatients was cut. They had a COPS program, which was a program for outpatient monies that were given for outpatient therapy. Now they go into a program called APG, and that program cut the amount of reimbursement that's available for outpatients, which is kind of odd because the governor's mantra has been to decrease the number of emergency room visits. The one thing that can cut that is providing funding for these kinds of programs, these outpatient programs that provide mental health. They've disappeared in Queens, and the suicide rate in Queens amongst Latinas has skyrocketed to almost 25% ideation, I should say. That's where they think about suicide. You look at Staten Island, you're talking nearly a quarter of the young women Latino women there are thinking about suicide. And these are areas where they've had to cut back and eliminate programs that provided outpatient services for people suffering from mental illness, young women suffering from mental illness. And so everything begins and ends with the budget.
Can I assume that you have not had this conversation with the governor, and can I also assume that you will be calling on the governor?
Oh, absolutely. We'll be calling on the governor and the commissioner. I want to make it a part of the agenda for the Black, Puerto Rican, Asian, Latino caucus. And so much that we're going to be talking about it.
That's coming up in San Juan starting on Thursday,
right.
Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday,
right.
which City and State will be there all the way through Sunday.
Right.
And you're bringing this issue up.
We don't have a structured program yet because it was too soon. But it's almost in February.
Well, you just wrote the column a week ago on City and State, and now you're getting the reaction.
Now I'm getting a lot of reactions, so now the pressure is on. And
but you'll get a chance in
Oh, yeah.
San Juan to be able to bring this
Oh
together?
no, we're going to talk
Are you
about the
caucusing
issue.
about this? Are you planning to do this and get?
I've spoken to the future chairman of Somos, Assemblyman Marcos Crespo.
From the Bronx also.
From the Bronx also. And I'll be talking to other legislators about the issue about creating a sign-on letter so that the governor can increase the amount of money to these kinds of programs that are servicing this target group. I'll be making a lot of noise coming up this session.
What we're going to do, Assemblyman Luis Sepúlveda, it's interesting. You mentioned Marcos Crespo, again, the new leadership, where people have taken it. We're going to be in a hub in San Juan, at the Condado Hilton, and we'll be talking to different people. As soon as you have that caucus, can we come in at the end and let us know what it is that you've done, or you can stop by the hub with your colleagues and sort of talk about this, because we're interested in this. This is not a sexy kind of item.
No,
and it's simply, this is hard.
This is something
and emotional, and I think that it impacts people that are behind the closet, hiding.
Absolutely. Look, as an elected official, we have to deal with power politics, right? We have to get elected. We have to do things to make sure that people remember what we're doing. But every now and then, as an elected official, you get an opportunity to do something that comes from the heart. And this is one of those issues for me, where I don't care if I bring a forum and the entire universe attends and they don't know that I had anything to do with creating it, but it's a forum that's effective, will get us more money, and will help suicide prevention amongst this group, then that's all well with me. This is an opportunity there, and they don't come very often. Usually we have to be worried about the political side of things. On this one, I don't really care about any of the politics involved. I don't care who gets offended when I ask for funding. Hopefully the governor will understand. I'll talk to the mayor also. Whoever will listen so that we can get adequate funding for this type of suicide prevention.
For our viewers in City and State TV, how do they get a hold of Assemblyman Luis Sepúlveda? How do they, if they're interested in this issue? I know that we have your information online based on that they should read your op-ed about this, which is, I think, is very interesting and very specific, and it has a lot of information there and meat, and I think they'll get to understand you better. For our viewers, how do they get a hold of Assemblyman Luis Sepúlveda?
Well, in the op-ed piece, by the way, there's a suicide prevention hotline there. So if you have these feelings, look at the op-ed piece.
Deal with that first.
Deal with that first and foremost. I give people my personal cell phone number. That's 347-582-8173. That's my personal cell phone number. If people want to discuss
and I've
this,
had it for a while, and he does respond to it. So, and you always respond, and you're very kind when you can, and you actually, I'm not into the texting, but I appreciate it. So,
but they can call me and we can discuss it. And if anyone wants to give us ideas, again, I'm an attorney by profession. This is not my area of expertise. I am now learning as much as possible, trying to absorb as much information. But if anyone has any information, any data, or any programs that they want to bring to our attention, we're open. We want to see how we can work this program.
Muchas gracias, Luis Sepúlveda. Nos vemos en San Juan on the road to Somos. This is Gerson Borrero for City and State TV, and we'll continue this conversation in San Juan from the conference, the fall conference of Somos el Futuro.